power in England was never held by kings alone. For nearly 400 years, much of it belonged to the Mortimers. Some families gather land, some gather titles. The Mortimers gathered everything, and then reached for the crown itself. They arrived with William the Conqueror, carved a lordship out of the wild Welsh borderlands, and built a dynasty on blood and stone. One of their number escaped the Tower of London, became the lover of a queen, and overthrew a king. Another married into the royal bloodline and placed the family within touching distance of the English throne. And yet, generation after generation, the crown slipped through their fingers, snatched away by rivals, by bad luck, and by the quiet cruelty of early death. In the end, it took a young woman who died at 22 to carry the Mortimer claim forward through her son and her grandson, until at last, a Mortimer descendant sat upon the throne of England. Tonight, we tell the whole story, slowly and softly, to ease you into sleep. Welcome and rest easy. You've found Sleepy Nobles. If this is your first night with us, consider yourself one of the household now. And if you've sat with us before, it's good to have you back by the fire. So lower the lights, rest your head, and let the cares of the day fall away. Tonight, we quietly open the doors of the House of Mortimer and tell their whole story. Their rise from Norman knights to the most dangerous family in England, their reach for the crown, and their place in history. Unhurried and gentle to carry you softly into sleep. In the autumn of 1066, when William, Duke of Normandy, gathered his great fleet upon the coast of northern France and prepared to sail for England, he did not travel alone. Alongside him came hundreds of knights and minor lords, each one hungry for land, for power, and for the kind of fortune that could only be won by the sword. Among them, or so tradition holds, was a man named Roger de Mortimer. We cannot say with certainty that Roger stood upon the beach at Pevensey when the Norman ships came ashore, or that he fought in the great clash at Hastings on that famous October day. The earliest records are thin, and the Mortimer name does not appear in the most reliable lists of the Conqueror's companions. What we do know is that a man of that name, Roger de Mortimer, held lands in Normandy in a small village called Mortimer-sur-Yonne, nestled in the region of the Pays de Bray. The family name itself, like so many Norman names, was simply the name of their home. Mortimer translates roughly as stagnant lake or dead water, a humble origin for a family that would come to hold such vast power. Whether Roger crossed the Channel with the invasion fleet or arrived shortly after, his descendants would establish themselves in England within a few short years of the Conquest, and they would never leave. It was Roger's son, or perhaps his grandson, the records are not always clear in these earliest generations, who truly planted the Mortimer flag in English soil. His name was Ralph, sometimes written as Ranulph, and he was the man who founded the English branch of the Mortimer dynasty by securing for himself a fortress that would become the family's seat of power for centuries to come. Wigmore Castle. Wigmore sat in the rolling, wooded countryside of northern Herefordshire, not far from the border between England and Wales. It was a frontier position, wild, exposed, and dangerous. But it was also a position of extraordinary strategic importance. The Welsh borderlands, known as the Marches, were unlike any other part of England. They were a lawless, contested zone where the authority of the English crown thinned to almost nothing, and where the men who held the great border castles, the Marcher lords, exercised a degree of power and independence that was unique in the feudal system of medieval England. The Marcher lords held their own courts, raised their own armies, waged their own wars against the Welsh, and answered to no one but the king. And even the king's authority was more theoretical than real in the wild lands beyond the Severn. The castle at Wigmore had originally been built in the years immediately following the Conquest by one of William's most trusted commanders, a man named William Fitz-Osbern, who had been made Earl of Hereford and given the task of guarding the western frontier against the Welsh. Fitz-Osbern raised the castle over the estates of two Saxon landowners who had lost everything in the upheaval of the Norman takeover. It was a sturdy, formidable structure, a motte and bailey fortress designed to dominate the landscape and to serve as a base for operations against the Welsh, who remained unconquered and deeply hostile to the Norman intruders. From its elevated position on a hillside above the village of Wigmore, the castle commanded views across the surrounding countryside, watching over the valleys and passes through which Welsh raiders might approach. Fitz-Osbern himself died in 1071, killed in battle in Flanders, far from the castle he had built. His son, Roger de Breteuil, inherited the earldom of Hereford, but proved to be a restless and ambitious man. In 1075, Roger de Breteuil joined a failed rebellion against William the Conqueror, the so-called Revolt of the Earls, and was punished with imprisonment for life. His lands were forfeit, and his castles, including Wigmore, were seized by the crown. It was at this moment that Ralph de Mortimer stepped forward. According to the old Wigmore Chronicle, a later document that must be treated with some caution, Ralph had already proven his loyalty to the king by besieging a Saxon rebel named Edric the Wild, sometimes called Edric Silvaticus, within the walls of Wigmore itself. Whether this account is entirely accurate or somewhat embellished by later Mortimer scribes, the result is clear. By 1086, the year of the Domesday Book, Ralph de Mortimer was recorded as the Lord of Wigmore and the holder of substantial estates in Herefordshire and Shropshire. The king had rewarded his loyalty with the castle and the lands that surrounded it, and Ralph had made Wigmore the centre of a growing barony, the so-called Honour of Wigmore, that would serve as the Mortimer heartland for generations. Ralph was not content merely to hold what the king had given him. He was a man of restless energy and sharp ambition, and the Welsh borderlands, the Marches as they were known, offered endless opportunities for a man willing to fight for them. In the early 1090s, Ralph used Wigmore as his base to launch an invasion into the Welsh region between the rivers Wye and Severn, a territory known in Welsh as Meilionid. He marched westward, building new castles at Diniethon and Cimarron as he went, using the latest Norman fortification techniques. The motte and bailey design, with its raised earthen mound topped by a wooden tower, surrounded by a palisade and ditch. These were not elegant structures. They were tools of conquest, built quickly and defended fiercely, and they allowed Ralph to push his authority deeper into Welsh territory than any Mortimer had gone before. But Ralph's ambitions were not limited to Wales. When William the Conqueror died in 1087, and the English crown passed to his son, William Rufus, the great Norman baronial families were forced to choose sides in the power struggles that followed. Ralph chose poorly. In 1088 he joined a rebellion of Marcher lords who supported Robert Curthose, the Conqueror's eldest son, against William Rufus. The rebellion failed, and Ralph paid a heavy price. He was banished, and his precious barony of Wigmore was forfeit. By 1104, Ralph had departed for Normandy, where he spent his remaining years never to recover his English position. The great castle he had fought so hard to win passed temporarily out of Mortimer hands. Ralph died sometime between 1104 and 1114. The precise date is lost. But the Mortimer name did not die with him. His son, Hugh de Mortimer, inherited the family's claim to Wigmore, and when the political landscape of England shifted once more, as it so often did in those turbulent years, Hugh found his opportunity. In 1135, King Henry VII died, and England was plunged into the long civil war known as the Anarchy, a bitter struggle between King Stephen and the Empress Matilda for control of the throne. Amid the chaos, Hugh de Mortimer was restored to Wigmore Castle, and the Mortimer dynasty was back where it belonged. Hugh proved to be a capable and long-lived lord. He reconquered Maleonid and the neighbouring territory of Elphail in 1144, reasserting the Mortimer grip on the Welsh borderlands that his father had first established. He captured Welsh princes, fought running battles with local chieftains, and expanded the family's holdings with a dogged persistence that would become a Mortimer hallmark. Hugh lived into old age, dying in 1184, by which time the Mortimers of Wigmore were firmly established as one of the leading families of the Welsh Marches. Not yet among the great Earls of England, but powerful enough to be reckoned with, and growing stronger with every generation. Hugh was succeeded by his third son, Roger, born around 1153. This Roger was perhaps the first Mortimer lord of Wigmore to be born in England rather than Normandy, and he continued the family's pressing expansion into Welsh territory. He fought, he built, he married, and he held on to what his family had won. The pattern was set. The Mortimers were border lords, hard, pragmatic men who lived by the sword and measured their worth in acres of conquered land. They were not yet players on the national stage. That distinction would fall to the next generation, and to a man whose story would carry the Mortimer name into the bloodiest chapters of English medieval history. In the year 1231, in the grey stone chambers of Wigmore Castle, a boy was born who would become the most celebrated Mortimer of his age. His name was Roger, and he was the son of Ralph de Mortimer, and a woman whose blood would intertwine the Mortimer line with the royal houses of both England and Wales. That woman was Gwladys Dhu, Gwladys the Dark, and she was a princess. Gwladys was the daughter of Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, known to history as Llywelyn the Great, the most powerful of the Welsh princes, who had unified much of Wales under his rule. Llywelyn's wife Joan was herself the daughter of King John of England, which meant that young Roger Mortimer, this boy born in a Marcher castle, heir to a barony built on Welsh conquest, carried the blood of both the English crown and the Welsh royal line in his veins. It was a remarkable inheritance, and it would shape his life in ways both profound and deeply ironic. For Roger Mortimer, 1st Baron Mortimer of Wigmore, would spend much of his career fighting against his own Welsh cousins. Roger grew up in the tumultuous world of the Welsh Marches, where the line between English territory and Welsh independence was always shifting, always contested, always drawn in blood. In 1247, when Roger was still a young man, he married Maud de Braose, the daughter of William de Braose, Lord of Abergavenny and Eva Marshall. Maud was herself a scion of a great Marcher family, and through her mother she was connected to the powerful Marshall Earls of Pembroke. The marriage brought Roger additional estates and strengthened his position as one of the leading barons of the border country. It was a marriage that would prove to be a true partnership, not merely in the management of lands and the raising of children, but in the hard, dangerous business of war and politics. Maud de Braose was no passive consort. She was a woman of courage and resourcefulness, and before the decade was out, she would play a role in one of the most dramatic episodes in English history. But first, there was the matter of Roger's cousin. In 1256, Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, the grandson of Llywelyn the Great, and therefore Roger Mortimer's first cousin once removed, launched an invasion of the Mortimer lordship of Gwythynion, near Rhyadr, in the heart of the Welsh borderlands. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd was an ambitious and formidable prince, determined to reassemble the dominion his grandfather had built. Roger Mortimer was equally determined to hold what his family had won. What followed was a bitter, intermittent war between two men who shared the same grandfather. A conflict that would continue for more than 25 years, until both men were dead. The war with Llywelyn was costly and exhausting. In 1262 and again in 1266, Roger was heavily defeated by the Welsh prince, and in 1267 by the Treaty of Montgomery, large portions of Mortimer land were formally surrendered to Llywelyn. It was a humiliating setback, but Roger was not a man who accepted defeat easily. He bided his time, tended his wounds, and waited for the larger currents of English politics to turn in his favour. Those currents were already in motion. In the 1260s, England was tearing itself apart in the Great Civil War between King Henry III and his barons, led by the charismatic and controversial Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester. The conflict, known to history as the Second Barons' War, would draw in every major family in England, and the Mortimers were no exception. Roger Mortimer chose the side of the king. He was a royalist to his core, a man who believed in the established order of crown and baronage, and he had little sympathy for Montfort's demands for greater baronial power and parliamentary reform. In May 1264, at the Battle of Lewes, Roger fought for Henry III against Montfort's forces and nearly lost his life in the process. The battle was a disaster for the royalists. The king's army was outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. Henry III was captured, and his son, Prince Edward, the future king. Edward I, a young man of exceptional military promise, was taken prisoner and held as a hostage to ensure his father's compliance. Montfort was, for the moment, the undisputed master of England, and he used his victory to impose a new constitutional settlement that placed real power in the hands of a council of barons, with himself at its head. For Roger Mortimer, the defeat at Lewes was a catastrophe, but it was also a call to action. He and Maud withdrew to the marches, where they began to plot the counterattack that would reverse the verdict of Lewes and restore the royal power. The plan they devised was as bold as it was dangerous. They would free Prince Edward from Montfort's custody, rally the royalist barons around the young prince, and destroy Montfort's army in the field. The rescue of Prince Edward was, by some accounts, Maud de Breauz's own idea. A plan conceived by a woman and carried out with a daring that would have done credit to any soldier. In late May 1265, while Edward was being held at Hereford under the supervision of Montfort's men, a plot was set in motion. Edward was allowed to exercise his horse outside the city walls, and during one of these outings he broke free from his guards and rode hard for the Mortimer lands, where Roger and his allies were waiting. The escape was a turning point. With Prince Edward free and at the head of a growing royalist army, the tide of the war began to turn. But the Mortimers were far from finished. In one of the most remarkable episodes of the war, it was Maud de Breauz, Roger's wife, who devised the plan to rescue Prince Edward from Montfort's custody. The details of the rescue are somewhat obscure, as is often the case with medieval events, but the result was decisive. Edward was freed, and he immediately made common cause with Roger Mortimer against Montfort. Together, they laid a trap. In August 1265, Montfort's army found itself cornered at Evesham in Worcestershire, hemmed in by the River Avon on 3 sides and Prince Edward's forces on the 4th. Roger Mortimer had sent his own men to block the only possible escape route, the bridge at Bengeworth. A terrible storm broke overhead as the two armies clashed. Montfort's Welsh soldiers, seeing that the day was lost, broke and ran for the bridge, where they were cut down by Mortimer's waiting men. The Battle of Evesham was less a battle than a massacre. Montfort's army was destroyed, and Montfort himself was killed in the fighting. According to the chronicles, it was Roger Mortimer who struck the fatal blow, or at the very least, who was credited with Montfort's death. What happened next tells you everything you need to know about the Mortimers of Wigmore and the world they inhabited. Roger Mortimer took Simon de Montfort's severed head, along with other parts of his body, and sent them to Wigmore Castle as a gift for his wife, Maud. It was, by the standards of the age, both a grim trophy and a gesture of devotion. It was also a statement of power. The Mortimers had helped to save the English monarchy, and they expected to be rewarded for it. The rewards came. Roger was confirmed in his Welsh territories, granted additional lands, and elevated in status and influence. But he was not a man to rest on his laurels. For the remainder of his life, he continued his war against the Welsh, fighting alongside the English crown to push back against Llywelyn ap Gruffudd's territorial ambitions. In 1276, when King Edward I, the prince whom Roger had helped to free, launched his great campaign to conquer Wales, Roger Mortimer was appointed captain for Shropshire, Staffordshire, and Herefordshire. He was, in effect, the king's senior military commander on the Welsh frontier, and he threw himself into the campaign with characteristic energy. The conquest of Wales was a long and brutal affair, and it would not be completed until 1283, a year after Roger Mortimer's death. But Roger lived long enough to see the tide turn decisively in England's favour. In 1282, during the final campaign against Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, Roger was given charge of operations in mid-Wales, a critical sector, and a mark of the trust that Edward I placed in him. It was here during this last campaign that Roger Mortimer died. On or about the 30th of October 1282, Roger passed away at Kingsland in Herefordshire. The exact cause of his death is not recorded. He may have fallen ill, or he may have succumbed to injuries sustained in the fighting. What we do know is that his death was considered a significant setback for the English campaign. He was a man of considerable military ability, and his loss was felt keenly. Roger was buried at Wigmore Abbey, the great religious house that served as the family's spiritual home and the resting place of their dead. His tombstone bore an inscription that read, "Here lies buried, glittering with praise, Roger the Pure, Roger Mortimer II, called Lord of Wigmore by those who held him dear." Just weeks later, in December 1282, his cousin Llywelyn ap Gruffudd was also killed, ambushed and cut down by English soldiers. There is a tradition, supported by some evidence, that Roger Mortimer's own sons, Edmund and Roger of Chirk, were implicated in the plot that lured Llywelyn out of his stronghold of Gwynedd to his death. The Mortimer cousin had murdered the Welsh cousin. The family feud that had begun when two grandsons of Llywelyn the Great found themselves on opposite sides of the border was over. Roger Mortimer left behind a legacy of war, loyalty, and ruthless ambition. He also left behind 6 children, including his eldest surviving son, Edmund, who would inherit the barony and who would, in turn, father the most famous and most infamous Mortimer of them all. Edmund Mortimer, the second Baron Mortimer of Wigmore, was a quieter figure than his father. Originally intended for a life in the church, he had studied at Oxford and been made Treasurer of York. Edmund was pulled back into the secular world when his elder brother Ralph died in 1274, leaving Edmund as the unexpected heir to the Mortimer barony. He married Margaret de Fiennes, a woman of Norman descent, and settled into the life of a marcher lord, managing his estates, attending to his duties, and raising a family. Edmund died at Wigmore Castle on the 17th of July, 1304. His death was not dramatic or violent. He simply passed away, as men of his time often did, in the place where he had lived. But he left behind something far more consequential than anyone could have imagined at the time. A 17-year-old son named Roger, who had already inherited the lordship of Wigmore and who was, even then, beginning to show the traits, the boldness, the charm, the calculating intelligence, that would make him the most dangerous man in England. Roger Mortimer was born on the 25th of April, 1287 at Wigmore Castle. He was a child of the Welsh marches, raised in a world of stone castles, feudal obligation, and constant low-level warfare on the border. He was also, through his great-grandmother Gwladys Du, a descendant of both the Welsh princes and the English royal house, a lineage that gave him connections in many directions, though it did not, as yet, give him a claim to the crown. 3 years before his father's death, when Roger was still a boy of 14, he was married to Joan de Geneville, the second Baroness Geneville. It was a match of enormous significance. Joan was an heiress in her own right, and through her, Roger gained control of Ludlow Castle, one of the greatest fortresses in the Marches, and a stronghold that would become closely associated with the Mortimer name for generations to come. The marriage also brought Roger lands in Ireland, where the Genevilles held substantial lordships. Roger was, by the time he reached his majority, one of the wealthiest and most powerful young men in England. He was also, by all accounts, a man of striking personal qualities. The chronicles describe him as intelligent, competent, and ambitious. A skilled soldier, a shrewd politician, and a man who inspired loyalty in those who served him. He was knighted in 1306 at the age of 19, during a grand ceremony at Westminster alongside the future Edward II and dozens of other young noblemen. The knighting was part of the celebrations surrounding the first Scottish campaign of King Edward III, the old and formidable monarch whose wars of conquest had reshaped the map of Britain. Roger was entering the stage of English politics at a moment of transition. The great Edward V was nearing the end of his reign, and the uncertain, troubled reign of his son was about to begin. In February 1308, Roger attended the coronation of the new King of England, Edward II, carrying a table bearing the royal robes in the ceremony's procession. It was a mark of honour, and it signalled that the Mortimers were firmly established among the inner circle of the English nobility. Roger's uncle, Roger Mortimer of Chirk, a man who had played a prominent role in Edward III's Welsh wars, and who had been rewarded with the great lordship of Chirk in northern Wales, was by this time one of the most powerful figures in the Marcher region. The uncle and nephew together commanded a block of territory and military strength that made the Mortimers a force to be reckoned with on any political stage. In the early years of Edward II's reign, Roger proved himself a loyal and effective servant of the crown. His most significant service came in Ireland, where the Mortimer estates, inherited through his wife Joan de Geneville, were under constant threat. In 1316, a grave crisis erupted when Edward Bruce, the brother of King Robert the Bruce of Scotland, invaded Ireland with a Scottish army, aiming to make himself King of Ireland and to open a second front in Scotland's war against the English crown. The invasion threw the English lordship of Ireland into chaos. Local Irish chieftains seized the opportunity to rebel, and several of the Anglo-Norman lords, Antes, including the Lacys, who were kinsmen of Roger's wife Joan, allied themselves with the Scottish invaders. Roger led an English army to confront the threat. In 1316, he fought against the combined Scottish and Irish forces at Kells, where he suffered a defeat, a rare setback that forced him to withdraw temporarily. But Roger was not easily discouraged. In November 1316, he was appointed as King Edward II's lieutenant in Ireland, the crown's senior military representative in the lordship, and he used this authority to rally the English settlers and mount a counter-offensive. Over the following months, Roger was largely instrumental in breaking the power of the Scottish invasion and in driving the Lacys from the lordship of Meath. Edward Bruce was eventually killed at the Battle of Forghart in 1318, and the Scottish threat to Ireland was ended. Roger's success in Ireland cemented his reputation as one of the ablest military commanders in England. He returned to the marches with his prestige enhanced and his confidence reinforced. He had served the king loyally and effectively, and he had every reason to expect that his loyalty would be rewarded and his position respected. But Edward II's reign would prove to be one of the most troubled in English history, and Roger Mortimer's relationship with the crown would follow a path from loyalty through disillusionment to outright rebellion. The root of the trouble was Edward II himself. He was, by most accounts, a poor king, weak-willed, easily influenced, and fatally prone to lavishing favour upon a small circle of personal favourites at the expense of his broader baronial class. His first great favourite was a Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston, whose closeness to the king enraged the English barons and led to years of political crisis. The exact nature of the relationship between Edward and Gaveston has been debated for centuries. Whether it was an intimate bond, an intense friendship, or something that defies easy modern categorization, but its political consequences were devastating. Gaveston was arrogant, dismissive of the established nobility, and seemingly unaware of the depth of resentment he was provoking. He gave the barons insulting nicknames, flaunted the jewels and gifts that Edward showered upon him, and behaved at tournaments and public occasions as though he were the king's equal, or even his superior. The barons who had fought for and bled for the English crown found Gaveston's presumption intolerable. In 1312, a group of barons led by the Earl of Lancaster seized Gaveston and executed him. An act of extra-legal violence that shocked the political world, but that the barons considered a necessary remedy. Edward was devastated by Gaveston's death, but the lesson he drew from it was not the one his barons had intended. Rather than moderating his behaviour, Edward simply waited for a new favourite to take Gaveston's place. That favourite was Hugh Despenser the Younger. Where Gaveston had been flashy and careless, Despenser was calculating and systematic. He was a man of insatiable ambition and considerable cunning, and he used his influence over the king to amass wealth and power on a scale that alarmed even the most tolerant of the English lords. He acquired lordships, extorted lands from weaker neighbours, manipulated the courts to seize estates that did not belong to him, and bullied anyone who stood in his way. Worse still, from the Mortimer perspective, Despenser's appetites were concentrated in the Welsh marches, the very territory where the Mortimers and their allies had held sway for generations. Despenser was not merely a rival, he was an existential threat to the Mortimer position in Wales and the border country. The crisis came to a head over the lordship of Gower in South Wales. William de Braos, the Lord of Gower, was in desperate financial straits and had sold the inheritance of his lordship multiple times. First to Roger Mortimer, then to John de Mowbray, and finally, in desperation, to Hugh Despenser the Younger himself. The tangled mess of competing claims to Gower became a flashpoint for the broader conflict between the Marcher lords and the Despensers. Roger Mortimer and his allies saw the Despenser takeover of Gower as part of a deliberate campaign to swallow up the Marcher lordships, one by one, and they determined to resist by force. In 1317, Roger had been associated with the Earl of Pembroke's Middle Party in English politics, a moderate faction that sought to steer a course between the extremism of Lancaster and the favouritism of the court. But by 1321, the space for moderation had collapsed entirely, and Roger was forced to choose a side. By 1321, the tension had become unbearable. Roger Mortimer, along with Humphrey de Bohun, Earl of Hereford, and other Marcher lords, rose in open rebellion against the Despensers. This conflict, known to historians as the Despenser War, was short, violent, and ultimately unsuccessful. In May 1321, Roger and his allies seized Despenser properties in South Wales, including the great fortress of Caerphilly Castle, and pillaged Glamorgan and Gloucestershire. They then marched north to join forces with Thomas of Lancaster, the king's powerful cousin, who had his own long-standing reasons for opposing the crown. In June, the barons swore a formal alliance at Sherburn in Elmet, naming their faction the Contrariants, and pledging to remove the Despensers by any means necessary. Roger led his army eastward toward London, reaching as far as St Albans in late July before being turned back. The city of London refused to open its gates to the rebels, and Roger found himself unable to force his way in. The capital's refusal to support the uprising was a critical blow, and the rebellion began to unravel. Edward II, galvanized by the threat to his throne, moved decisively against the rebels. Thomas of Lancaster was defeated at the Battle of Boroughbridge in March 1322, and subsequently executed, beheaded as a traitor, a fate that had not been visited upon an Earl of the realm for more than 2 centuries. The Marcher lords, isolated and outnumbered, were forced to submit. In January 1322, Roger Mortimer and his uncle, Roger Mortimer of Chirk, surrendered to the king at Shrewsbury. Some chroniclers suggest that they were promised fair treatment, perhaps even guaranteed their lives, by the Earl of Pembroke and other loyalist barons who persuaded them to lay down their arms. If so, the promise was not fully kept. Both Rogers, uncle and nephew, were sentenced to death for treason. The formal sentence specified that they should be drawn and hanged, the standard punishment for traitors. The sentence was, however, commuted to life imprisonment, perhaps in recognition of Roger's earlier service to the crown in Ireland, or perhaps because the king feared that executing so prominent a baron might provoke further unrest in the marches. Instead, both men were taken to the Tower of London and locked away. Their lands were confiscated, their titles stripped, and their families left to face an uncertain future. Roger Mortimer of Chirk, the uncle, would never leave the Tower. He died there on the 3rd of August 1326, after more than 4 years of captivity, broken in body and spirit by the long years of confinement. He was buried at Wigmore Abbey among his ancestors, but the nephew, the young Roger, the Lord of Wigmore, the man who had defied a king and lost, was not yet finished. In fact, he was only just beginning. For while Roger sat in his cell in the Tower of London, his mind was already working, already planning, already calculating, already looking for the moment when fortune would turn again in his favour. And fortune, as it happened, was already on its way. For more than 18 months, Roger Mortimer languished in the Tower of London. He was confined in a cell, guarded around the clock, and kept under the closest possible watch. The Tower, in the early 14th century, was not merely a fortress. It was the most formidable prison in England, a place from which escape was considered all but impossible. In the centuries since its construction by William the Conqueror, only a handful of prisoners had ever managed to break free, and many of those had been recaptured within days. Roger, however, had advantages that most prisoners did not. He was popular, he was well connected, and the Tower in those years was crowded with other political prisoners, men who had been locked up for opposing Edward II and the Despensers, and who were more than willing to help one of their own make a bid for freedom. Among them, a conspiracy began to take shape. The plan was both audacious and meticulously prepared. Roger had not been idle during his months of captivity. The Tower of London, in the early 1320s, was home to a considerable number of political prisoners, men who had been swept up in the aftermath of the Contrariant Rebellion, and who shared Roger's hatred of the Despensers and his contempt for the king who had imprisoned them. Among these prisoners, a conspiracy began to take shape, and its central figure was Roger Mortimer. The other prisoners recognized in him the qualities that made him a natural leader: the intelligence, the boldness, the sheer force of personality. And they agreed that if any man could escape the Tower and carry the banner of resistance back into the wider world, it was Mortimer. The success of the plan depended on the complicity of at least one person inside the Tower's own administration. A man named Gerard d'Alspay, the deputy constable, who had been either bribed or persuaded to betray his trust. Some accounts suggest that d'Alspay was moved by sympathy for the prisoner's cause. Others imply that the inducement was financial. Whatever his motives, d'Alspay became the linchpin of the escape. Without him, the most carefully laid plans would come to nothing. The locks would remain locked, the doors would remain shut, and Roger Mortimer would remain a prisoner until the day Edward II decided to have him killed. And that day, the conspirators knew, was drawing closer. As long as Roger lived, he represented a potential threat to the Despenser regime. Hugh Despenser the Younger had been pressing the king to change his mind about the commutation of Roger's death sentence, and it was only a matter of time before Edward yielded. The escape had to happen soon, or it would not happen at all. The date chosen was the 1st of August, 1323, the eve of the feast of St. Peter ad Vincula, the patron saint of the Tower's chapel. It was a date that was steeped in symbolism for Roger. St. Peter in chains, the saint who had been freed from his shackles by an angel, was the perfect patron for a prisoner planning to break free. But the choice was also deeply practical. The feast day was traditionally an occasion for celebration among the Tower's garrison, a night when the guards would be eating, drinking, and making merry late into the evening. It was the one night of the year when the Tower's security would be at its most relaxed. The preparations were made with extraordinary care. Rope ladders were smuggled into the Tower, piece by piece, and hidden until they were needed. A boat was arranged to wait on the Thames on the southern bank to carry Roger across the river as soon as he cleared the walls. Horses were positioned at relay points along the road to the south coast, so that Roger could ride without stopping to a waiting ship. Every detail was planned, every contingency considered. On the night of the escape, a feast was laid for the Tower's warders. d'Alspay had ensured that the wine was liberally supplied, and that it was laced with a powerful sleeping draught, some noxious concoction that would put the drinkers into a deep and prolonged sleep. As the evening wore on and the celebrations reached their peak, one by one, the guards succumbed. The constable of the Tower, Stephen de Segrave, fell asleep with the rest. The sentries on the walls grew drowsy. The corridors grew quiet. The great fortress, for a brief and precious window of time, was unwatched. d'Alspay moved quickly. He had prepared a route through the castle that avoided the most heavily guarded areas. He unlocked Roger's cell and led him through the darkened passages of the castle, down through the kitchens, where a hole had been made in the stone wall, or, in some accounts, where Roger and his helpers climbed up through a chimney to reach the rooftops. From the roof, using the rope ladders that had been smuggled in over the preceding weeks, Roger scaled the inner wall of the Tower compound and dropped down into the space between the inner and outer fortifications. Then he climbed the outer wall, a formidable barrier of stone that had been designed to keep the most determined attackers at bay, and dropped down on the far side. Below him, in the darkness, a boat was waiting on the Thames. Roger was rowed across the river, was met by friends on the far bank, and rowed hard through the night toward the south coast of England. The relay of horses worked as planned, each fresh mount carrying him further from London, further from the reach of the king's officers. Within 2 days, before the alarm had even fully spread, Roger Mortimer was out of the country, aboard a ship bound for France. the most daring prison break in English history, was complete. The news of Roger's escape sent shockwaves through the court of Edward II. The king was furious and deeply frightened. He knew what kind of man Roger Mortimer was. He had seen his abilities as a soldier, his cunning as a politician, and his capacity for ruthless action. A man of such caliber, now free and burning with a desire for revenge, was capable of almost anything. Edward ordered an immediate and exhaustive hunt for the escaped prisoner, dispatching writs to every port and every county commanding that Mortimer be seized and returned to custody. Stephen de Segrave, the constable who had slept through the escape, was punished for his negligence. Delspay, whose betrayal had made the whole thing possible, was arrested and dealt with in due course. But it was all too late. Roger was already beyond the king's reach. In France, Roger Mortimer found sanctuary. He made his way to Paris, where he was received with careful courtesy by the French court. This was a shrewd choice of destination. Relations between England and France were already badly strained. Edward II had been dragging his feet on his feudal obligations to the French crown regarding the English-held Duchy of Aquitaine, and Charles de Montfort of France, who was the brother of Edward's queen, Isabella, was actively looking for ways to apply pressure on the English king. A powerful, aggrieved English exile with military experience and political connections was exactly the kind of asset that the French court found useful. Roger was given lodgings and income and access to the corridors of French power. He settled into his new life with the patience of a man who knew that his moment would come. He watched events in England closely, maintained contact with sympathizers at home, and waited for the opportunity that he was certain would present itself. He had escaped the Tower. He had crossed the sea. He had survived. And now, in the gilded halls of the French court, Roger Mortimer began to plan not merely his return to England, but the overthrow of the king who had tried to destroy him. What he could not have known as he walked the corridors of the French palaces and plotted his revenge was that his most powerful ally was already on her way to meet him, and that she was none other than the Queen of England herself. Isabella of France was one of the most remarkable women of the medieval age. Born around 1295, she was the daughter of King Philip IV of France, a ruler so powerful and so feared that he was known as Philip the Fair. Isabella had been married to Edward II in 1308, when she was only 12 or 13 years old, and from the very beginning, the marriage had been difficult. Edward's devotion to his favourites, first Piers Gaveston, then Hugh Despenser the Younger, left Isabella increasingly isolated, humiliated, and bitter. She was a queen in name, but she was treated as an afterthought. Despenser, in particular, worked to undermine her position at court. He whispered in the king's ear, sowed suspicion about her loyalty, and gradually stripped her of her income, her lands, and her influence. By the mid-1320s, Isabella was a woman with very little left to lose, and a great deal of anger to fuel her. In March 1325, an opportunity presented itself. The long-running dispute between England and France over the Duchy of Aquitaine had reached a critical point, and Edward II needed to send a representative to Paris to negotiate with King Charles IV. Isabella volunteered for the mission, arguing, with perfect logic, that Charles was her brother, and that she was therefore the ideal person to mediate between the two crowns. Edward, perhaps relieved to be rid of her, agreed. Isabella sailed for France, taking with her the couple's eldest son, the 13-year-old Prince Edward. She had no intention of coming back. In Paris, Isabella found not only her brother's court, but also Roger Mortimer, who had been living in exile in France for nearly 2 years. The precise timeline of their relationship is a matter of some debate among historians. Some have suggested that Isabella and Roger had already been in contact before her arrival in Paris, perhaps even that she had played a secret role in his escape from the Tower. Most scholars, however, believe that their affair began only after Isabella reached France in 1325. What is beyond dispute is that, once they were together, they became inseparable, and that their partnership would prove to be one of the most formidable political alliances of the entire medieval period. Roger and Isabella shared a common enemy in Hugh Despenser, and a common grievance against Edward II. They also shared a ruthless determination to do whatever was necessary to bring the king down. Over the following months, they began to assemble the resources they would need for an invasion of England. This was no easy task. The King of France, despite his sympathy for his sister, was reluctant to provide direct military support for an invasion of a fellow Christian kingdom. Roger and Isabella were forced to look elsewhere. They found their answer in the Low Countries, in the person of William, Count of Hainault, whose daughter, Philippa, was betrothed to the young Prince Edward. In exchange for the promise of a royal marriage, William provided Isabella and Roger with a small but well-equipped army. Approximately 1,500 soldiers, including heavily armed men-at-arms and Hainaulter crossbowmen. It was a tiny force by the standards of the day. But Isabella and Roger were gambling that they would not need a large army. They were betting on the sheer unpopularity of Edward II and the Despensers, the hope that once they landed on English soil, the people and the barons would flock to their banner. On the 24th of September 1326, Isabella and Roger's fleet landed on the coast of Suffolk, near the town of Orwell. The young Prince Edward, now 13 years old, was with them, a detail of immense symbolic importance, for it meant that the invasion was not merely a baronial rebellion, but a royal expedition led by the Queen and the heir to the throne. Isabella's army marched inland under a banner that proclaimed them to be the liberators of England from the tyranny of the Despensers. And the gamble paid off immediately. The speed of the political collapse that followed the landing was breathtaking. As Isabella's army marched westward through East Anglia and into the heart of England, the expected wave of support materialized with a force that exceeded even the invaders' hopes. The Earl of Norfolk, the Earl of Leicester, and dozens of lesser barons rallied to the Queen's cause, bringing their retainers and their soldiers with them. Towns opened their gates. Garrisons surrendered without a fight. The common people who had suffered under the Despensers' misrule and who associated Isabella with the promise of reform cheered the Queen's forces as they passed. Edward II, stunned by the speed of the collapse, fled westward with Hugh Despenser, desperately seeking loyal support that no longer existed. The king made for Wales, the traditional Despenser stronghold, hoping to find a safety in the great fortresses of the border country. But even Wales, the land where the Despensers had built their power, offered no refuge. The castles that had once been Despenser fortresses now closed their gates against the fleeing king. Edward was a monarch without a kingdom, a ruler without subjects, a man whose authority had evaporated like morning mist in the September sun. One by one, the king's remaining allies abandoned him, melting away into the countryside or switching sides to join Isabella's growing army. The royal treasure was lost. The government machinery ground to a halt. England, for a few chaotic weeks, was a kingdom without effective rule. The end came swiftly and without mercy. Hugh Despenser the Elder, the father, was captured at Bristol and summarily hanged in October. His execution carried out with the brutal efficiency of men who had waited years for their revenge. Hugh Despenser the Younger, the man whose greed and ambition had set the entire catastrophe in motion, who had driven Roger Mortimer into rebellion and Isabella into exile, was captured in November. His execution, carried out at Hereford on the 24th of November, was a public spectacle. He was dragged through the streets, hanged on a gallows 50 feet high, and then cut down while still alive for the remainder of his punishment. It was the end that the Despenser's enemies had long demanded, and it was watched by Isabella herself. Edward II was captured shortly afterward. He was taken into custody and conveyed to Kenilworth Castle, where he was held under the supervision of his cousin, Henry of Lancaster. In January 1327, a parliament was summoned at which Edward was formally deposed, forced to abdicate the throne in favour of his 14-year-old son, who became King Edward III. The act of deposition was, in legal and constitutional terms, unprecedented. No English king had ever been formally removed from the throne before. The machinery of government was pushed into uncharted territory, and the hand guiding that machinery belonged in large part to Roger Mortimer. But the deposed king remained alive, and a living ex-king was a dangerous thing. Edward was moved from Kenilworth to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, where he was placed in the custody of Thomas Lord Berkeley, a man who was, not coincidentally, the son-in-law of Roger Mortimer. Berkeley had little love for Edward. His own father had died during an earlier period of imprisonment imposed by the king, and Berkeley had no reason to treat his royal prisoner with particular kindness. The chronicles that were written in the decades following Edward's deposition paint a grim picture of his final months. According to Geoffrey Le Baker, writing some 30 years after the event, Edward was subjected to deliberate mistreatment. Starved, humiliated, and held in a cell above rotting animal carcasses, in the hope that the stench and the disease would kill him without the need for overt violence. But Edward, who was described as being physically strong and resilient, survived. On the night of the 21st of September, 1327, Edward II died at Berkeley Castle. The official announcement, made shortly afterward, attributed his death to natural causes. Grief-induced illness, perhaps, or some unspecified sickness brought on by the rigours of captivity. But the official story was not the only story. In the years and decades that followed, darker rumours began to circulate. The most famous and most lurid account of Edward's death appeared in the Chronicle of Geoffrey Le Baker, written around 1340. According to Le Baker, Edward was murdered by a group of men who held him down, inserted a horn into his body, and thrust a heated metal implement through it, burning his internal organs. The method, Le Baker implied, was chosen as a cruel reference to Edward's alleged intimate relationships with his male favourites. This story, the red-hot poker, has become one of the most famous narratives in English royal history. But it must be treated with great caution. There are no primary sources from the time of Edward's death that describe such a method. The earliest accounts say only that he died, without specifying a cause. The red-hot poker story does not appear until more than a decade later, and its author, Le Baker, was deeply hostile to Queen Isabella and may have been constructing a narrative designed to portray Edward as a martyr. Some modern historians have gone further, questioning not merely the method of Edward's death, but the very fact of it. The historian Ian Mortimer, no relation to the medieval family despite the suggestive surname, has argued that Edward II may have survived Berkeley Castle entirely, escaping or being allowed to escape, and living out his remaining years in obscurity on the European continent. This theory rests in part on the so-called Fieschi letter, a document written by a Genoese priest named Manuele Fieschi, which claims that Edward fled Berkeley in disguise and eventually settled in a hermitage in Italy. The Fieschi letter remains deeply controversial, and the majority of historians still accept the traditional account that Edward II was murdered at Berkeley Castle, almost certainly on the orders of Roger Mortimer, with the knowledge or acquiescence of Queen Isabella. What is beyond doubt is that in the years immediately following the supposed death, a number of influential people, including Edward's own half-brother Edmund, Earl of Kent, and several senior clergymen, believed that the former king was still alive and attempted to arrange his rescue. Whether Edward II died in 1327 or lived on in secret, the political reality was the same. By the autumn of that year, the old king was gone, removed from the stage one way or another, and the new king, Edward III, was a boy of 14, too young to rule on his own. The country needed a regent, and Roger Mortimer was more than ready to fill the role. In the years that followed the fall of Edward II, Roger Mortimer became the most powerful man in England. He was not king. That title belonged to the young Edward III, and he held no formal office of regency. But through his relationship with Queen Isabella, who served as the effective head of the Council of Regency during her son's minority, Roger exercised a degree of control over the English government that was, in all practical terms, indistinguishable from royal authority. He used that authority with a brazenness that shocked even his contemporaries. In October 1328, Roger was created Earl of March, the first person to hold that title, and a distinction that placed him among the highest ranks of the English peerage. The title was not merely an honour. It came with vast territorial grants. The lordships of Denbigh, Oswestry, and Clun, formerly belonging to the Earl of Arundel, as well as the Marcher lordships that had been held by his uncle, Roger Mortimer of Chirk, and the lordship of Montgomery, granted to him personally by the Queen. Roger was assembling an empire within England, and he was doing so with a speed and a greed that alarmed the other barons. He lived like a king. He dressed like a king. He held court with a magnificence that rivaled, and sometimes exceeded, that of the young Edward III himself. At a great tournament held at Wigmore in 1328, Roger presided over the festivities with a splendour that left no doubt about who he considered to be the true ruler of England. The round table, which he staged in imitation of the Arthurian legends, was a deliberate display of royal pretension. He was, in everything but the crown itself, acting as though the throne were his. But Roger's position was inherently unstable. He was not a king, and he had no hereditary right to rule. His power rested entirely on two foundations: the support of Queen Isabella and the weakness of the young Edward III. If either of those foundations crumbled, his position would collapse with it. The cracks began to appear almost immediately. Roger's insatiable appetite for land, titles, and wealth provoked a growing backlash among the English barons. Henry, Earl of Lancaster, one of the very men who had supported the deposition of Edward II, organised an armed resistance against Mortimer's rule. The attempt failed in part because the young Edward III remained passive, apparently unwilling or unable to challenge his mother's lover. But the resentment was real, and it was growing. Roger's foreign policy made matters worse. In 1328 he negotiated the Treaty of Northampton with Scotland, by which England formally recognised Scottish independence and renounced all claims to suzerainty over the Scottish crown. The treaty was wildly unpopular in England, where it was seen as a shameful surrender of the gains that Edward III had spent decades fighting for. The English public dubbed it the Shameful Peace, and Roger's reputation suffered a heavy blow. But it was an act of domestic brutality that sealed Roger Mortimer's fate. An act so shocking that it united the English political world against him and convinced even his former allies that he had gone too far. In the early months of 1330, Edmund, Earl of Kent, the half-brother of the deposed Edward II, became embroiled in a conspiracy to free his brother, whom he believed was still alive and imprisoned in secret somewhere in England. The Earl of Kent was not alone in this belief. Several senior clergymen, including the Archbishop of York and the Bishop of London, also appeared to credit the rumour that Edward II had survived Berkeley Castle. Whether the rumour was true, whether the deposed king was genuinely alive, hidden away in some remote castle or monastery, or whether the whole thing was an elaborate trap laid by Roger Mortimer to ensnare his enemies, remains one of the great unanswered questions of the period. What is clear is that Roger used the conspiracy to destroy the Earl of Kent. Edmund was arrested, brought before a parliament that Roger controlled, and found guilty of treason. On the 19th of March, 1330, he was led out of Winchester Castle to be executed, but the sentence was so shocking, the execution of a prince of the blood, the uncle of the reigning king, that no one could be found willing to carry it out. Edmund stood in the cold for hours, waiting for a headsman who would not come, while the lords and commons of England looked on in horror. Finally, a convicted criminal from the Marshalsea prison was brought forward and offered a pardon in exchange for performing the execution. Edmund, Earl of Kent, was beheaded. The execution of the Earl of Kent was a step too far. Edmund was a member of the royal family, a prince of the blood, the uncle of the young king, a man who had been one of the leading supporters of Isabella and Mortimer's own invasion just 4 years earlier. His death horrified the English political class and convinced many that Roger Mortimer had become a tyrant who would stop at nothing to maintain his grip on power. The murmuring of discontent that had been building for years now swelled into something approaching open revolt. Henry, Earl of Lancaster, renewed his calls for resistance. Other barons who had until now been too cautious or too frightened to act began to look towards the young Edward III as their only hope. And Edward was ready. He had been watching, learning and waiting for 3 long years. He was, by all accounts, a far more formidable character than his deposed father. Intelligent, decisive, physically imposing, and possessed of a personal charisma that would later make him one of England's greatest kings. He had endured years of Mortimer's dominance, years of being treated as a puppet, years of watching a man who was not a king behave as though the throne belonged to him, years of seeing his mother reduced to the compliant partner of a man whose ambition knew no boundaries. The execution of the Earl of Kent, the murder of his own uncle, was the final provocation. Edward resolved to act. In October 1330, a parliament was summoned at Nottingham. Roger and Isabella took up residence in Nottingham Castle, confident in their security. They had no reason to expect trouble. The castle was strong, and Roger's network of spies and informers had until now kept him well ahead of any potential threats. But Edward III had been quietly assembling his own conspiracy. Working with a small group of trusted allies, including William de Montague, Robert de Ufford, and others, the young king laid a plan to seize Mortimer by force. On the night of the 19th of October, Edward and his men entered Nottingham Castle through a secret underground passage, a tunnel that led from the castle's exterior into the heart of the fortress, bypassing the gates and guards that Mortimer had placed to protect himself. The conspirators burst into the rooms where Roger and Isabella were staying. There was a brief, violent struggle. 2 of Mortimer's guards were killed. Isabella, realizing what was happening, is said to have cried out to her son, "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer," a plea that Edward ignored. Roger Mortimer was seized, bound, and taken prisoner. He was conveyed to the Tower of London, the very prison from which he had made his famous escape 7 years earlier, and held there while his fate was decided. On the 26th of November 1330, he was brought before Parliament. He was not allowed to speak in his own defence. 14 charges were read against him, including the usurpation of royal power, the murder of Edward II, and the execution of the Earl of Kent. The charges were declared to be notorious, self-evident to all, and no trial was deemed necessary. On the 29th of November 1330, Roger Mortimer, 1st Earl of March, was drawn through the streets of London to Tyburn, the place of execution for common criminals, and hanged. Some accounts say that he was stripped naked before being put to death, a final humiliation designed to underscore that he was dying not as a nobleman, but as a traitor. He was 43 years old. His body was left hanging for 2 days before being taken down and eventually buried at the Greyfriars Church in London. His widow, Joan de Geneville, petitioned for the return of his remains, and in time his body was moved to Wigmore Abbey, where it joined the long line of Mortimer dead. Isabella, for her part, was spared. Edward III confined his mother to comfortable quarters, first at Windsor and later at Castle Rising in Norfolk, where she lived in relative luxury for the remaining 28 years of her life. She died in 1358, having taken the veil of a nun in her final years. Whether she mourned Roger Mortimer, or whether she came to see their partnership as the great mistake of her life, the chronicles do not say. The fall of Roger Mortimer was spectacular, and it could have been the end of the Mortimer story. A family that had reached for the crown and failed, dragged down by the hubris and greed of one man, their name tainted by treason, their estates forfeit, their future seemingly destroyed. But the Mortimers were not finished. They were, in fact, only getting started. The execution of the 1st Earl of March left the Mortimer family in ruins. Their titles were stripped. Their estates were confiscated. Their name was synonymous with treason, and the stain of Roger's crimes hung over every member of the household. It would have been entirely natural for the Mortimers of Wigmore to fade into obscurity, to become just another fallen family in the long catalogue of medieval England's political casualties. That they did not, that they rose again, higher than before, and positioned themselves within touching distance of the English crown, is a testament to the extraordinary resilience of the Mortimer bloodline and to the strange, unpredictable currents of medieval dynastic politics. The man who began the work of rehabilitation was Roger's grandson, Roger Mortimer, the 2nd Earl of March. He had been born on the 11th of November 1328 at Ludlow Castle, just 2 years before his grandfather's fall. His father, Sir Edmund Mortimer, had died in 1331, shortly after the first Earl's execution, leaving the infant Roger as the head of a disgraced and dispossessed family. The boy grew up in the shadow of his grandfather's crimes, bearing a name that was synonymous with treason in a world that had little reason to offer him kindness or favour. The young Roger grew up in a world that had little reason to favour him. His family's lands had been seized by the crown, and his prospects were uncertain at best. For more than a decade, the Mortimer fortunes languished. Roger held no title, commanded no estates, and wielded no power. He was a nobleman in name only. A reminder of a family that had once shaken the foundations of the English throne and had been broken for its ambition. But Edward III, who had overthrown the first Earl, proved to be surprisingly generous towards the Mortimer heir. Perhaps the king recognised that the sins of the grandfather should not be visited upon the grandchild indefinitely. Perhaps he calculated that a restored and grateful Mortimer family would be a more useful asset than a permanently embittered one. A loyal bulwark on the Welsh frontier rather than a source of festering resentment. Perhaps, too, there was an element of guilt. Edward III knew, better than anyone, what his mother and her lover had done, and he may have felt that the younger Mortimers deserved a chance to redeem their name. Whatever the reason, Edward III gradually returned the Mortimer holdings to the young Roger over the course of the 1340s. In 1342, Roger received back the lordship of Radnor. The following year, the old family seat at Wigmore was restored to him. The castle where Mortimers had lived for nearly 300 years, and which had been confiscated after his grandfather's fall. And in 1354, in a formal act of royal grace, the Earldom of March itself was reinstated. The Mortimers were back. The second Earl of March proved worthy of the king's trust. He was not the bold, swashbuckling figure that his grandfather had been. He was quieter, steadier, a man who understood that the path back to respectability lay through loyalty and service, not through the kind of dramatic gestures that had brought the first Earl to Tyburn. Roger dedicated himself to the great wars that Edward III was waging against France, the opening campaigns of what would later be known as the 100 Years' War. And it was on the battlefields of France that he remade the Mortimer name. In 1346 and 1347, the young Earl fought in the great campaign that culminated in the Battle of Crécy, one of the most celebrated English victories of the medieval period. At Crécy, on the 26th of August 1346, an outnumbered English army, its ranks stiffened by the deadly English and Welsh longbowmen who would become the terror of European armies, destroyed a far larger French force on the muddy fields of northern France. It was a victory that announced England as a major military power, and that transformed the reputation of Edward III from an untested young king into one of the great warrior monarchs of Christendom. Roger Mortimer, fighting alongside his king, acquitted himself with distinction and earned the respect of his fellow soldiers. In recognition of his service, Roger was made a Knight of the Garter, one of the highest honours that an English king could bestow, and a mark of personal favour from Edward III. He was also appointed Constable of Dover Castle and Warden of the Cinque Ports, positions of considerable responsibility and military significance that placed him among the most trusted commanders in the realm. The Mortimers, it was clear, had been fully rehabilitated. The stain of 1330 had been washed clean by service and sacrifice. Roger married Philippa Montague, the daughter of William Montague, 1st Earl of Salisbury, one of the very men who had helped Edward III overthrow his grandfather in 1330. It was a marriage that symbolised the reconciliation between the Mortimer family and the crown, and it produced a son who would carry the family forward into the next generation. But the second Earl's life was cut short. On the 26th of February, 1360, Roger died at Rouvray in France, at the age of just 31. He may have been wounded in battle, or he may have succumbed to one of the many diseases that ravaged medieval armies in the field. He was buried at Wigmore Abbey, alongside his ancestors. His death was a blow to the family, but the foundations he had laid, the recovered estates, the restored title, the rebuilt reputation, would serve his successors well. Roger left behind a young son, Edmund, who became the 3rd Earl of March. Edmund had been born on the 1st of February 1352 and was still a child of 8 at the time of his father's death. As a ward of the crown, the boy was placed under the care of 2 powerful guardians, William of Wykeham, the Bishop of Winchester and one of the most influential churchmen of his age, and Richard Fitzalan, the 10th Earl of Arundel, one of the richest and most powerful barons in England. It was under these guardians' supervision that Edmund's future was shaped, and that the most consequential marriage in the entire Mortimer history was arranged. There had originally been a plan to marry young Edmund to Alice Fitzalan, the daughter of the Earl of Arundel, a match designed to bring the Arundel lordship of Chirk which had been lost at the fall of the first Earl in 1330, back into Mortimer hands. But this plan was abandoned when a far more glittering prospect presented itself. On the 24th of August 1369, Edmund Mortimer, 3rd Earl of March, was married to Philippa of Clarence at a ceremony at Reading Abbey. He was 17 years old, she was 14, and together, without fully understanding what they had done, they had lit the fuse that would eventually explode into the Wars of the Roses. To understand why this marriage mattered so profoundly, we need to step back and look at the family tree of King Edward III, who was by this time an aging monarch approaching the end of his long and glorious reign. Edward had 5 sons who survived to adulthood. The eldest was Edward, the Black Prince, whose own son would become King Richard II. The second surviving son was Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, who had died in 1368. The third was John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, a man of enormous wealth and towering ambition who would play a central role in the politics of the next 3 decades. The fourth was Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, and the fifth was Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester. Philippa of Clarence was the only child of Lionel of Antwerp, Edward III's second surviving son. Through her mother, Elizabeth de Burgh, she had also inherited the earldom of Ulster and vast estates in Ireland. When Philippa married Edmund Mortimer, she brought with her not only these lands and titles, but something far more valuable: a place in the line of succession to the English throne. Through Philippa, the Mortimer children would be the heirs of Lionel of Antwerp, and therefore, by the laws of ordinary descent, they would have a claim to the crown that was senior to that of any descendant of John of Gaunt, the third son. This was the seed from which the Wars of the Roses would grow. Edmund Mortimer, 3rd Earl of March, does not appear to have pressed his new position aggressively during his own lifetime. He was a busy and capable lord, deeply involved in the political life of England in the final years of Edward III's reign, and he had more immediate concerns than a theoretical claim to a crown that was not yet vacant. But his marriage to Philippa placed him at the heart of one of the most significant political contests of the age, the struggle between the sons and grandsons of Edward III for influence, power, and, ultimately, the succession. In the Good Parliament of 1376, one of the most significant parliaments of the medieval period, and a landmark in the development of English parliamentary government, Edmund's own steward, Peter de la Mare, served as Speaker of the Commons. De la Mare was a man of exceptional courage and ability, and he led a fierce campaign against corruption at court, opposing the influence of John of Gaunt and his allies, impeaching several of the king's advisers, and even procuring the banishment of Alice Perez, the king's mistress. Edmund himself was among the lords who supported the Prince of Wales's faction against the court party, and he was appointed to the administrative council that was set up by Parliament to advise the ageing and increasingly frail Edward III. It was a position that required considerable political courage, for John of Gaunt was a dangerous man to cross, and the stakes were high. In the autumn of 1376, Edward III, or more accurately, John of Gaunt, who was effectively ruling England on behalf of his dying father, attempted to exclude Philippa of Clarence and her descendants from the succession by having Edward III's will entailed upon male heirs only. If successful, this manoeuvre would have barred the Mortimers from the throne entirely, since their claim ran through a female line. Gaunt even floated the idea of adopting the Salic law, the French law of succession that barred women from inheriting the crown, as English practice. Parliament refused, and the attempt failed. But it was a clear warning that the Gaunt-Lancaster faction regarded the Mortimer claim as a serious threat and was prepared to use any means to neutralize it. Philippa of Clarence passed her claim to the throne to her children, and then she died, sometime between 1377 and 1378, leaving Edmund a widower with several young children. Edmund threw himself into his duties in Ireland, where the Mortimer estates, inherited through Philippa's mother's side, were under constant threat from Gaelic Irish chieftains who had never accepted English lordship and who raided and burned with impunity. On the 27th of December 1381, Edmund Mortimer, 3rd Earl of March, died at the Dominican Friary in Cork. He was 29 years old, another Mortimer cut down before his time, in a family that seemed unable to escape the curse of early death. His body was eventually brought back to England and buried at Wigmore Abbey, in the place where Mortimers had been laid to rest for more than 2 centuries. Edmund left behind 4 children who would each, in their own way, shape the course of English history. The eldest son, Roger, would inherit the earldom and the claim to the throne. The second son, another Edmund, would become a rebel, a traitor, and a key figure in one of the most dramatic episodes of the Welsh Wars. A daughter, Elizabeth, born in 1371, would marry one of the most famous warriors in English history, Henry Hotspur Percy, the dashing, headstrong son of the Earl of Northumberland, and the youngest daughter, Philippa, named after her mother, would carry the Mortimer blood into yet another branch of the English nobility. The story of the Mortimers would enter its most turbulent chapter yet. Roger Mortimer, 4th Earl of March, was born on the 11th of April 1374 at Usk in Monmouthshire. He was the eldest son of Edmund and Philippa, and from the moment of his birth he occupied a position of extraordinary significance in the political landscape of England. Through his mother, he was the great-grandson of King Edward III, descended through the second surviving royal son, Lionel of Antwerp. This placed him, by the ordinary rules of primogeniture, ahead of every descendant of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th sons, including the powerful and ambitious line of John of Gaunt. Roger's father died when the boy was just 7 years old, and the young Earl became a ward of the crown. He was placed under the guardianship of Thomas Holland, 2nd Earl of Kent, and in due course he was married to Holland's daughter, Alianora, a match that further strengthened his connections to the upper reaches of the English aristocracy. But it was the boy's position in the line of succession that defined his importance. King Richard II, who had inherited the throne from his grandfather Edward III, through the Black Prince, had no children. The question of who would succeed him was therefore one of the most pressing and most dangerous issues in English politics. By the accepted rules of descent, the answer should have been straightforward. The crown should pass to the nearest male line descendant of Edward III's eldest surviving line, and if that line failed, to the next senior line. With the Black Prince's line ending in the childless Richard, the next senior line was that of Lionel of Antwerp, and the heir of that line was the young Roger Mortimer. In 1385, according to most accounts, Richard II publicly acknowledged Roger as his heir presumptive. This was, on the face of it, an extraordinary honour, a formal recognition that the Mortimers stood next in line for the English crown. But the reality was more complicated than it appeared. The Mortimer History Society has noted that Richard II never officially recognised the Mortimers as having a claim in any constitutional or legal sense, and that he pointedly refused to acknowledge Roger as his heir in 1394. Richard's true motives remain unclear. It is possible that he used the Mortimer claim as a political tool, a way of keeping his uncle John of Gaunt and Gaunt's ambitious son, Henry Bolingbroke, in check, without ever intending to allow the Mortimers to actually inherit the throne. Whatever Richard's intentions, the perception among the English political class was clear. Roger Mortimer was the heir to the throne. he was the man who would be king when Richard died. And this perception shaped everything that followed. Roger himself seems to have been a man of considerable personal appeal. The chronicles describe him as enjoying great popularity in England, and he appears to have navigated the treacherous politics of Richard II's court with skill and restraint, avoiding the factional conflicts that consumed so many of his contemporaries. He took no active part in opposing the king's increasingly authoritarian rule, even as other barons grew restive and resentful. Much of Roger's time was spent in Ireland, where the Mortimer estates required constant attention and where the English position was under perpetual threat from Gaelic Irish chieftains. Roger served several terms as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, the Crown's senior representative in the lordship, and he accompanied Richard II on the king's expedition to Ireland in 1394. But his efforts to bring order to the Mortimer lands in Ireland met with limited success, and the Irish campaigns proved to be a source of frustration rather than glory. It was during one of these Irish campaigns that Roger Mortimer met his death, and with it, the Mortimer claim to the throne suffered a blow from which it would never fully recover. On the 20th of July 1398, Roger was leading a military operation against Irish clans near the town of Kells, in what is now County Kilkenny. The engagement was supposed to be a routine affair, a punitive expedition against rebellious local chieftains, but something went terribly wrong. According to the chroniclers, Roger rode far ahead of his main force, rushing toward the enemy with a recklessness that was out of character for a man who was normally described as prudent and cautious. Worse still, he was wearing Irish clothing. He had adopted the dress and customs of the native Irish, a practice that was technically illegal for English lords in Ireland, and that, on this fateful day, had a devastating practical consequence. His own soldiers did not recognize him. When the Irish warriors closed in, Roger was cut off from his escort, surrounded, and killed. He was 24 years old. According to one chronicle, his body was torn to pieces by his attackers before the fragments could be recovered and sent back to England for burial at Wigmore Abbey. The death of Roger Mortimer sent shockwaves through the English political world. The heir to the throne, the man whom many had expected to become the next King of England, was dead, killed in a minor skirmish on the Irish frontier, wearing the wrong clothes in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a death that was simultaneously tragic, absurd, and profoundly consequential. The monk of Evesham, one of the chroniclers who recorded the event, noted that Roger's body was torn apart by his attackers. A detail that underscores the ferocity of the encounter and the chaos that engulfed the English force once its commander fell. The fragments of Roger's body were eventually recovered by his soldiers and conveyed back to England, where they were buried at Wigmore Abbey, the ancient Mortimer resting place where generation after generation of the family had been laid to rest beneath the cold stone floors. It was a bitter homecoming for a young man who should have lived to wear a crown. Roger's widow, Eleanor Holland, was left with 4 small children and a name that carried both immense privilege and immense danger. She remarried in June 1399 to Edward Charlton, 5th Baron Charlton of Powys, and died in October 1405. But her children, Anne, Edmund, Roger, and Eleanor, would carry the Mortimer legacy forward into the next century, each of them shaped in their different ways by the burden of their father's unfulfilled destiny. For Richard II, who had lost his presumptive heir, the death prompted a fateful decision. Richard was genuinely shaken by the news from Ireland. The death of the man he had publicly acknowledged as his successor represented not merely a personal loss, but a constitutional crisis. With Roger dead, the question of the succession was thrown open once more, and the vultures were already circling. Richard resolved to lead a second military expedition to Ireland, to avenge Roger's death, to punish the Irish chiefs who had killed the heir to the English throne, and to reassert the authority of the English crown over its most troubled lordship. It was a decision that would cost Richard his kingdom. In May 1399, Richard sailed for Ireland with a substantial army, leaving England in the hands of his uncle, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, who served as regent in the king's absence. Richard's departure created exactly the vacuum that his enemies had been waiting for. His cousin Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, who had died earlier that year, had been living in exile in France, banished by Richard for his involvement in earlier political disputes. With the king safely across the Irish Sea, Bolingbroke saw his chance. In July 1399, he landed in Yorkshire with a small force, claiming, initially at least, that he had come only to recover his inheritance, the vast Lancastrian estates that Richard had seized after Gaunt's death. But Bolingbroke's ambitions went far beyond the recovery of his father's lands. As he marched southward, the barons of England rallied to his banner with an enthusiasm that revealed the depth of resentment against Richard's increasingly tyrannical rule. By the time Richard returned from Ireland in August, it was too late. His army melted away, his allies deserted him. He was captured at Conway Castle in Wales and taken to London, where, in a scene of calculated humiliation, he was forced to abdicate the throne in favour of Bolingbroke, who crowned himself King Henry IV. The English crown, which the Mortimers had come so close to claiming, passed instead to the House of Lancaster. The descendants of John of Gaunt, Edward III's third surviving son. By the ordinary rules of inheritance, the Lancastrians had no right to the throne while the Mortimer line survived. The second son's line should have taken precedence over the third son's. But Henry Bolingbroke had an army, and in the brutal arithmetic of medieval politics, an army trumped a pedigree. The legal niceties of the succession were swept aside by the brute fact of military power. Roger's eldest son, Edmund, was just 7 years old when his father died and just 8 when the throne was stolen from under him. The boy inherited his father's titles, his father's estates, and his father's claim to the English crown, a claim that was now not merely theoretical but actively dangerous, for it placed the young Edmund Mortimer at the centre of every conspiracy against the Lancastrian usurpers. The year 1399 was a year of revolution. In September of that year, Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt, the grandson of Edward III through the third surviving royal son, returned from exile, raised an army, and forced King Richard II to surrender the throne. Richard was deposed, imprisoned, and eventually died, probably murdered, at Pontefract Castle in February 1400. Henry crowned himself King Henry IV, founding the Lancastrian dynasty that would rule England for the next 6 decades. But Henry's claim to the throne was, by the strict rules of hereditary succession, deeply flawed. John of Gaunt had been the third surviving son of Edward III. The second surviving son, Lionel of Antwerp, had left a line of descendants through his daughter Philippa. And those descendants were the Mortimers. The young Edmund Mortimer, 5th Earl of March, was, by the laws of ordinary descent, the rightful heir to the crown. He had a better claim than Henry Bolingbroke, and everyone knew it. This made the 8-year-old Edmund the most dangerous child in England. Henry IV was acutely aware of the threat that the Mortimer claim posed to his fragile grip on the throne. He could not simply execute the boy. That would have been too shocking, too blatant, too likely to provoke the very rebellion it was designed to prevent. Instead, Henry chose a subtler approach. He placed Edmund and his younger brother Roger under close supervision, keeping them in secure custody. Not quite prisoners, but certainly not free. They were held at Windsor Castle under the watchful eye of the Crown, their movements restricted, their contacts monitored. But if the young Edmund himself posed no immediate threat, the adults around him were a different matter entirely. The Mortimer name had become a rallying cry for everyone who opposed the Lancastrian usurpation, and, over the next several years, a series of rebellions and conspiracies would invoke the Mortimer claim as justification for armed resistance to Henry IV. The most dramatic of these upheavals involved a man whose name Shakespeare would later immortalize, and whose real story was even more extraordinary than the playwright's version. Sir Edmund Mortimer, known to historians as Edmund Mortimer the Rebel, to distinguish him from his nephew the Earl, was the second son of the third Earl of March, and his wife, Philippa of Clarence. He had been born on the 10th of December 1376 at Ludlow Castle, and he was therefore, like his nephew, a great-grandson of Edward III, through Lionel of Antwerp. He was a Mortimer to his bones. A landowner in the Welsh marches, a holder of estates that bordered the untamed Welsh interior, and a man who had been raised in the tradition of border warfare that had defined his family for centuries. In the spring of 1402, Sir Edmund found himself at the sharp end of one of the most dangerous crises of Henry IV's reign. Owain Glyndŵr, a Welsh nobleman of ancient lineage who had proclaimed himself Prince of Wales, had launched a full-scale rebellion against English rule. The revolt had begun in 1400, and by 1402 it had engulfed much of Wales, threatening the English marcher lordships that the Mortimers and other families had spent centuries building. In June of that year, Glyndŵr's forces burned the border town of Knighton, which lay within Sir Edmund Mortimer's territory. Mortimer responded as his ancestors had always responded. He gathered an army and marched to meet the enemy. He assembled a force of approximately 2,000 men and pursued Glyndŵr's rebels into the hills of central Wales. On the 22nd of June, 1402, the two forces met near the town of Pillith, at a place called Bryn Glas, a steep, bracken-covered hillside that rose sharply above the river valley. The battle that followed was a catastrophe for the English. One of the worst defeats suffered by an English force on Welsh soil in the entire medieval period. Glyndŵr had chosen his ground with the instinct of a natural tactician, drawing the English uphill into a steep, narrow valley where their numerical superiority counted for little, and where the terrain itself became an enemy. The Welsh archers, positioned on the higher ground, rained arrows down upon the English ranks as they struggled up the slope. Worse still, a significant number of Sir Edmund's Welsh soldiers, men who had been recruited from the border communities and whose loyalties were divided between their English employers and their Welsh kinsmen, defected to Glyndŵr's side during the fighting. The betrayal was devastating. At the critical moment of the battle, the men whom Mortimer had trusted to hold his flanks turned their weapons against their own comrades. The English line collapsed, and what had begun as an orderly advance became a rout. The English army was destroyed. Between 600 and 1,100 English soldiers were killed, according to various estimates. A staggering toll for a relatively small engagement. The aftermath was grim. According to several chronicles, the Welsh women who accompanied Glyndŵr's army descended upon the battlefield after the fighting and mutilated the bodies of the English dead, an act of revenge, it was said, for the plundering and violence that English soldiers had inflicted on Welsh communities in previous campaigns. Whether these reports are entirely accurate or were exaggerated by English chroniclers seeking to portray the Welsh as savages, they convey something of the ferocity and bitterness that characterised the Glyndŵr rebellion. Sir Edmund Mortimer himself was captured, taken alive on the battlefield, wounded and exhausted, and brought before Owain Glyndŵr as a prisoner of war. What happened next was extraordinary, and it revealed the depth of the political fault lines that ran through Henry III's England. Henry V, upon learning of Mortimer's capture, refused to pay his ransom. This was a shocking breach of the normal customs of war. Ransom was a well-established practice in medieval warfare, an accepted and honourable mechanism for recovering captured nobles, and a convention that was understood and respected by all parties. The refusal to ransom a captured knight was not merely unusual, it was an insult, a declaration that the captured man was unworthy of the crown's protection. Henry's refusal was widely understood as a deliberate act of political calculation. He did not want Sir Edmund Mortimer free. A Mortimer at liberty, with his family's claim to the throne, his military experience, and his connections to the rebellious Welsh, was a threat that Henry preferred to keep permanently confined. But Henry's strategy backfired spectacularly. Sir Edmund, abandoned by the king he had served, turned against him. He renounced his allegiance to the Lancastrian crown, publicly put forward his nephew's claim to the English throne, and married Catherine, the daughter of Owain Glyndŵr. The Mortimer of the Welsh marches had thrown in his lot with the Welsh rebels, and the resulting alliance shook the foundations of Lancastrian rule. The alliance was strengthened further by the involvement of the powerful Percy family of Northumberland, the mightiest noble house in northern England, and a family whose military resources were second only to the crown's. Elizabeth Mortimer, Sir Edmund's sister, was married to Henry Hotspur Percy, one of the greatest soldiers of his age, a man whose reputation for bravery and ferocity in battle had made him a legend on both sides of the Scottish border. Hotspur and his father, Henry Percy, 1st Earl of Northumberland, had been among Henry the Thor's most important supporters during the usurpation of 1399. It was the Percys who had helped Bolingbroke seize the throne, and it was the Percys who had expected to be rewarded with land, titles, and influence. But Henry IV, once securely on the throne, had proved ungrateful. The Percys felt cheated of the rewards they had been promised, and their resentment deepened with every passing year. When Sir Edmund Mortimer was captured by Glyndŵr at Bryn Glas, and when Henry IV refused to ransom him, the Percys saw the king's decision for what it was, not merely an act of political calculation, but a betrayal of one of their own kinsmen. Hotspur's wife, Elizabeth, was Sir Edmund's sister. The refusal to ransom her brother was a personal insult to the Percy family, and it pushed them decisively into the camp of the rebels. In July 1403, Hotspur raised the banner of rebellion and marched south from Northumberland to confront Henry IV. His plan was to join forces with Glyndŵr's Welsh army and with his own father's troops from the north, creating a combined force that would overwhelm the Lancastrian government. But Henry IV, who was a far more capable military commander than his critics gave him credit for, moved with unexpected speed. He intercepted Hotspur's army before it could link up with its allies and forced a battle at Shrewsbury on the 21st of July, 1403. The Battle of Shrewsbury was one of the bloodiest engagements of the English medieval period. A savage, close-fought affair in which English archers on both sides unleashed clouds of arrows at each other across a narrow field. Hotspur, leading his men with characteristic recklessness, was killed in the fighting. Struck down, according to tradition, as he raised the visor of his helmet and was hit by an arrow. His death was a devastating blow to the rebel cause. Without their charismatic leader, the rebel army collapsed, and Henry IV won a hard-fought but decisive victory. Hotspur's body was displayed publicly to prove that he was dead, and his head was sent to York to be mounted on the city gates as a warning to other would-be rebels. Elizabeth Mortimer, Hotspur's widow, Edmund Mortimer's sister, was left a widow with a young son, the future second Earl of Northumberland. She would later remarry to Thomas Camoys, first Baron Camoys, and she died in 1417. But the broader Mortimer-Percy alliance survived Hotspur's death, at least for a time. In February 1405, the conspiracy reached its most ambitious and most fantastical expression. At Tuckhill, in the Welsh borderlands, Owain Glyndŵr, Sir Edmund Mortimer, and Henry Percy, first Earl of Northumberland, Hotspur's father, who had not been present at Shrewsbury and who remained at liberty, met and signed a document that has become known as the Tripartite Indenture. This extraordinary agreement, dated the 28th of February, 1405, proposed nothing less than the dismemberment of England and Wales. Under its terms, Glyndŵr would receive Wales and a substantial portion of western England, extending as far as the rivers Severn and Mersey, and including most of Cheshire, Shropshire, and Herefordshire. Sir Edmund Mortimer, acting on behalf of his nephew, the Earl of March, would take southern and central England, encompassing everything south of the Trent. And the Earl of Northumberland would take the Midlands and the north. The Tripartite Indenture was, by any measure, a wildly ambitious scheme. A plan to dismember the Kingdom of England and divide it among three men who, at that moment, controlled only a fraction of the territory they proposed to carve up. Most historians have treated it as something of a fantasy, a document that reveals the dreams of the conspirators rather than any realistic plan of action. But in the context of early 1405, when Glyndŵr controlled much of Wales and had even summoned a parliament at Machynlleth in which he was recognised as Prince of Wales, when the Percy family still commanded powerful forces in the north, when local English communities along the border had ceased active resistance and were making their own treaties with the Welsh rebels, and when the Lancastrian government was still fragile and contested, the plan did not seem entirely impossible. The Cistercian and Franciscan orders were reportedly funneling funds to the Welsh cause, and old allies of the deposed Richard II were sending money and arms. But the moment of possibility passed quickly, and the alliance crumbled piece by piece. In August 1405, a French expeditionary force, a substantial body of professional soldiers sent by King Charles VI, landed in Wales and marched with Glyndŵr's men into England. The combined Welsh and French army advanced into Worcestershire, and for a brief, terrifying moment it seemed as though the Tripartite Indenture might actually be realised. But the campaign stalled. At Woodbury Hill, the rebel forces faced Henry IV's desperate army across a valley, and neither side was willing to risk a decisive engagement. After several days of inconclusive manoeuvring, the French lost heart and withdrew, eventually returning to France. It was the high watermark of Glyndŵr's rebellion, and from this point, the tide turned steadily against the Welsh. In 1408, the Earl of Northumberland was killed at the Battle of Bramham Moor, removing the last major English ally of the Welsh rebellion and ending the Percy family's involvement in the Mortimer cause. And then, in January 1409, Sir Edmund Mortimer himself died. He was at Harlech Castle, the great Welsh fortress that Glyndŵr had captured and made his headquarters. English forces were besieging the castle, slowly tightening the noose around the last stronghold of the rebellion. The exact circumstances of Sir Edmund's death are not well recorded. He may have been killed in the fighting, or he may have died of disease or starvation during the siege. He was 32 years old. With Sir Edmund's death, the Mortimer involvement in the Welsh rebellion came to an end. Glyndŵr himself fought on for several more years, but his power waned steadily. By 1415, the rebellion was effectively over. Glyndŵr vanished into the Welsh hills, and his ultimate fate remains one of the great mysteries of Welsh history. He was never captured, never killed in battle, and never surrendered. he simply disappeared. The Tripartite Indenture, the grand plan to carve up England and place a Mortimer on the throne, died with the men who had dreamed it. But the Mortimer claim to the crown lived on, embodied in the quiet, cautious figure of Edmund Mortimer, 5th Earl of March, who had watched from the sidelines as his uncle, his brother-in-law, and his allies fought and died in his name. Edmund Mortimer, 5th Earl of March, was born on the 6th of November 1391 at New Forest in Westmeath, on one of his family's Irish estates. He was the eldest son of Roger Mortimer, the 4th Earl, and Eleanor Holland, and from the moment of his birth the shadow of the English crown hung over his life. When his father was killed at Kells in 1398, the 7-year-old Edmund inherited not only the Earldom of March and the Earldom of Ulster, but also the position of heir presumptive to the throne of the childless king, Richard II. When Richard was deposed by Henry Bolingbroke the following year, Edmund's inheritance became something far more dangerous. A claim to the crown that was, by the accepted rules of descent, superior to that of the man who now wore it. Henry IV understood the danger. Throughout his reign, Edmund and his younger brother Roger were kept under close supervision. Not imprisoned exactly, but carefully controlled, their movements restricted, their contacts monitored. They were, in effect, gilded hostages, living reminders of the fragility of the Lancastrian claim. In February 1405, the threat to the Lancastrian dynasty took physical form when a bold attempt was made to abduct the young Edmund and his brother from Windsor Castle. The plan was to spirit the boys away and deliver them to the Welsh rebels, who would then use Edmund's claim as the basis for a new challenge to Henry IV's rule. The attempt failed. The boys were recaptured before they could be spirited out of the castle. Yes, but it underscored just how central the Mortimer claim was to the political calculations of the age. For the remainder of Henry IV's reign, Edmund lived in a kind of limbo, too important to be ignored, too dangerous to be released, and too young to act on his own behalf. He was latterly placed under the supervision of Henry, Prince of Wales, the future King Henry V's son, who was given personal responsibility for the Mortimer heir's safety and containment. Everything changed in 1413, when Henry IV died and his son became King Henry V. The new king was a very different ruler from his cautious, suspicious father. Where Henry IV had kept Edmund under lock and key, Henry V released him, not grudgingly or conditionally, but openly and generously. Edmund was made a Knight of the Bath, a prestigious honour, and was welcomed into the inner circle of the new king's court. It was an extraordinary act of trust, and Edmund appears to have repaid it with a loyalty that was, by all accounts, genuine and unwavering. This loyalty was put to the ultimate test in the summer of 1415. Henry V was preparing for a great military expedition to France, the campaign that would culminate in the legendary Battle of Agincourt. As the army gathered at Southampton, waiting for the fleet to sail, a conspiracy was uncovered that struck at the very heart of the Lancastrian dynasty. The plot, known to history as the Southampton plot, was led by 3 men: Richard of Conisburg, Earl of Cambridge, Henry Scrope, 3rd Baron Scrope of Masham, and Sir Thomas Grey. Their plan was to assassinate King Henry IV and replace him on the throne with Edmund Mortimer, whose hereditary claim they regarded as superior to the Lancastrian kings. Richard of Conisburg was Edmund's brother-in-law. He had married Edmund's sister, Anne Mortimer, around 1406. And he was himself a grandson of Edward III, through the 4th surviving son, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York. The conspirators planned to combine the Mortimer claim to the throne with a series of coordinated uprisings, Lollard revolts in the West Country, Percy rebellions in the North, that would overthrow the Lancastrian government and install Edmund as king. It was, on paper, a plausible scheme. But it had one fatal flaw. Edmund himself wanted no part of it. On the 31st of July, 1415, Edmund Mortimer went to King Henry V and revealed the entire conspiracy. He claimed, and there is no strong evidence to contradict him, that he had known nothing of the plot until it was already far advanced, and that he had come forward as soon as he understood what was being planned. Whether Edmund's protestations of innocence were entirely truthful is a question that historians have debated ever since. Some have suggested that Edmund may have known more than he admitted, and that he chose to reveal the plot not out of pure loyalty, but out of a cold-eyed calculation that the conspiracy was doomed to fail, and that his best hope of survival lay in betraying it. Others have taken Edmund at his word, arguing that he was a man of genuine integrity who wanted no part of a violent seizure of the throne. What is certain is that Henry V acted swiftly and decisively. Sir Thomas Grey was executed on the 2nd of August. Richard of Conisburg and Lord Scrope were tried by their peers, found guilty and beheaded before Bargate in Southampton on the 5th of August. Henry then embarked for France, and the rest, as the saying goes, is history. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Agincourt on the 25th of October, 1415, one of the most famous English victories of all time. Edmund Mortimer was formally pardoned on the 7th of August and accompanied the king to France. He took part in the siege of Harfleur, the great port city on the Seine that Henry captured in September 1415 after a grueling 5-week siege. But Edmund fell ill during the operation. Dysentery, the great killer of medieval armies, swept through the English camp. And he was too weakened to march with the main army when Henry set out on the bold and reckless overland march that would lead to Agincourt. He missed Agincourt itself, one of the most celebrated English victories in history, but his absence from the battlefield did not diminish his standing with the king. In the years that followed, Edmund served loyally and competently in Henry the Murphy's French campaigns, which gradually conquered vast swathes of northern France and established an English dominion that stretched from Calais to the Loire Valley. Edmund fought in the conquest of Normandy in 1417 and 1418, serving as the king's lieutenant in the duchy and helping to secure the gains that Henry's armies had won. He was present at the siege of Meaux in 1421 and 1422, one of the most grueling military operations of the war, during which Henry V himself contracted the dysentery that would eventually kill him. Throughout this period, Edmund's relationship with Henry V appears to have been genuinely warm. The two men had known each other since childhood. Henry had been Edmund's custodian during the final years of Henry V's reign, and there was a bond between them that went beyond mere political convenience. Henry trusted Edmund in a way that his father had never been able to trust any Mortimer, and Edmund repaid that trust with a constancy that was, by the standards of the age, remarkable. He had every reason to resent the Lancastrian dynasty. They had stolen his birthright, imprisoned him as a child, and used him as a pawn in their political calculations. And yet he chose, again and again, to serve them faithfully. When Henry V died in August 1422, struck down by dysentery at the age of just 35, at the height of his power and his glory, Edmund was appointed to the Council of Regency that governed England during the minority of the infant Henry VI, who was barely 9 months old when he became king. It was a position of great responsibility and trust, and it placed Edmund alongside the most powerful men in the realm. Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, who served as protector of the realm. John, Duke of Bedford, who commanded the English forces in France, and Henry Beaufort, Bishop of Winchester, who controlled much of the kingdom's financial machinery. Edmund quarrelled with Humphrey of Gloucester. Most councillors did, as the Duke was arrogant and difficult. But he served on the council with diligence and competence. He was, by this point, one of the most experienced and respected noblemen in England, and his presence on the council was valued not only for his administrative abilities, but for the legitimacy that his very name conferred on the Lancastrian regime. If Edmund Mortimer, the man with the best hereditary claim to the throne, was willing to serve the infant Henry VI, then surely the Lancastrian succession was secure. But Edmund's time was running short. In 1423, he was appointed the King's Lieutenant in Ireland, a position that had been held by several of his Mortimer ancestors, including his father, the 4th Earl, who had died in Ireland at the age of 24. Ireland had always been a dangerous posting for the Mortimers, and it would prove no different for Edmund. He travelled to Ireland in the autumn of 1424, arriving at the Mortimer Castle of Trim in Westmeath, and on the 18th of January, 1425, he died of plague. He was 33 years old. Edmund left no children. His marriage to Anne Stafford, which had taken place around 1415, had produced no heirs. A childlessness that may have been a source of private sorrow, but which was, in its dynastic consequences, devastating. With his death, the male line of the Mortimer Earls of March came to an end. The dynasty that had begun with Ralph de Mortimer's seizure of Wigmore Castle more than 300 years earlier was extinct. There would be no more Earls of March named Mortimer. There would be no more Lords of Wigmore bearing that ancient name. The long line that stretched back to the Norman Conquest, through the Welsh wars, through the Tower escape and the overthrow of a king, through the marriage to Philippa of Clarence and the claim to the English crown, all of it ended here, in a castle in Ireland, with a man who died of plague. The Wigmore Chronicle, the family's own historical record, described Edmund in words that carried a weight of quiet dignity. Severe in his morals, composed in his acts, circumspect in his talk, and wise and cautious during the days of his adversity. It was, perhaps, the most fitting epitaph that could have been written for the last of the Mortimers. A man who had carried the weight of a crown he never wanted, who had watched others fight and die for a claim he refused to press, and who had died in the end not on a battlefield or on a scaffold, but of a disease, in a castle far from home. In the land where so many Mortimers had gone to govern and to die. His body was brought back to England and buried at Clare Priory in Suffolk, where he had founded a college of secular canons in 1414. He was not buried at Wigmore Abbey, the ancient family resting place where his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, and generations of Mortimers before them lay at rest. The age of Wigmore was over, but the Mortimer story was not. Edmund Mortimer, the last Earl of March, died childless in January 1425. But he had a sister, and that sister had a son, and through that son, the Mortimer claim to the English crown would pass into the bloodline that would ultimately sit upon the throne. Her name was Anne Mortimer, and she was the eldest daughter of Roger Mortimer, the 4th Earl of March. The man who had been heir presumptive to Richard II and who had been killed at Kells in 1398. Anne was born on the 27th of December, most likely in the year 1388, though some sources place her birth as late as 1390. She was, through her father, a great-great-granddaughter of King Edward III, descended through the line of Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, Edward's second surviving son. Around 1406, Anne was married to Richard of Conisburgh, Earl of Cambridge. Richard was himself a grandson of Edward III, but through a different and junior line. The line of Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, who had been Edward III's 4th surviving son. The marriage was not, at the time, considered particularly significant. Richard of Conisburgh was a relatively minor figure, a younger son with little land and less income. Anne was the daughter of a powerful but recently deceased Earl, whose family had been touched by rebellion and misfortune. It was, in the eyes of the great world, a modest match. It would prove to be one of the most consequential marriages in English history. For the marriage of Anne Mortimer and Richard of Conisbrough united two separate lines of descent from Edward III. Through Anne, their children would carry the claim of Lionel of Antwerp, the second son, the senior line, the line that had been bypassed when the Lancastrians seized the throne. Through Richard, they would carry the claim of Edmund of Langley, the fourth son, a junior line but one that ran in direct male descent, father to son, without the interruption of a female link. Together, these two claims created a composite right to the English crown that was, by any measure, formidable. Anne and Richard had at least 3 children together, a daughter, Isabella, and 2 sons, Henry and Richard. Henry died young. It was the second son, Richard, who would carry the family's fortunes forward. Anne Mortimer died on or about the 22nd of September, 1411. She was approximately 22 years old. The cause of her death is not recorded with certainty, but it is widely believed that she died in or shortly after childbirth, quite possibly giving birth to her son Richard, who was born on the 21st of September, 1411. She was buried at All Saints' Church in King's Langley, Hertfordshire. Centuries later, when the tomb at King's Langley was opened, 3 skeletons were found inside. The third, in a separate casket, was identified as a young woman under 30 with auburn hair. It is believed to be Anne Mortimer, the quiet, forgotten link between the Mortimer dynasty and the crown of England. Her husband, Richard of Conisbrough, survived her by just 4 years. In 1415, he was the ringleader of the Southampton plot. The conspiracy to depose Henry V and place his brother-in-law, Edmund Mortimer, on the throne. When Edmund revealed the plot to the king, Richard was arrested, tried and beheaded at Southampton on the 5th of August 1415. He was 30 years old. His execution left the 4-year-old Richard, Anne Mortimer's son, an orphan. The boy had lost his mother at birth, his father to the executioner's block, and his uncle to the headsman at Southampton. He was, by any reckoning, a child with nothing, but the child had a claim. Through his mother, Anne Mortimer, the young Richard was the heir of Lionel of Antwerp, the descendant of Edward III's second son, with a claim to the throne that was, in strict hereditary terms, senior to that of the ruling Lancastrian kings. Through his father, Richard of Conisbrough, he was the grandson of Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, with a claim in the direct male line from Edward III's 4th son. And when his childless uncle, Edmund Mortimer, 5th Earl of March, died of plague in Ireland in 1425, the boy inherited the entire Mortimer estate. The Earldom of March, the Earldom of Ulster, the Lordship of Wigmore, the vast Mortimer lands in Wales, Ireland and England. Combined with the lands and titles he had already inherited from his father's side of the family, particularly the Dukedom of York, which passed to him on the death of his uncle Edward, Duke of York, at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. The young Richard Plantagenet became one of the wealthiest and most powerful nobles in England. He was also, by any reasonable interpretation of the laws of succession, the rightful King of England. Richard grew to manhood, married Cecily Neville, the daughter of the Earl of Westmoreland, and served the Lancastrian kings in France and Ireland with distinction. But the question of the crown never went away. As the reign of the weak, pious, and eventually mentally incapacitated Henry VI descended into chaos in the 1440s and 1450s, Richard of York became the focus of opposition to the Lancastrian government. His rivals at court, the Duke of Somerset, the Queen Margaret of Anjou, and their allies, sought to exclude him from power, and in doing so they pushed him, step by step, toward the ultimate confrontation. In 1460, Richard of York formally laid claim to the English throne before Parliament. His argument was simple and devastating. He was the descendant of Edward III's second son through the Mortimer line, and his claim was therefore senior to that of Henry VI, who descended from the third son. Parliament, unable to deny the logic of his argument but unwilling to depose a reigning king, struck a compromise. Henry VI would remain king for the rest of his life, but Richard of York would be recognised as his heir, displacing Henry's own son, Prince Edward of Lancaster. It was a compromise that satisfied no one, and it lasted barely 2 months. In December 1460, Richard of York was killed at the Battle of Wakefield, ambushed by Lancastrian forces near Sandal Castle in Yorkshire. His head was cut from his body, adorned with a paper crown in mockery of his royal pretensions, and displayed on the walls of the city of York. But the Mortimer claim did not die with him. Richard left behind 3 sons who would continue the fight. The eldest, Edward, was 18 years old, tall, handsome, and ferociously capable on the battlefield. In March 1461, Edward defeated the Lancastrian forces at the Battle of Towton, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, and claimed the throne of England as King Edward IV. The Mortimer dream was realised at last. Edward IV was the great-great-great-grandson of Philippa of Clarence, through the Mortimer line. He was the grandson of Anne Mortimer, the quiet young woman who had died at 22 and been buried with auburn hair in a small Hertfordshire church. He was the inheritor of a claim that had been passed down through 5 generations of Mortimers. From the 3rd Earl who had married a princess, through the 4th Earl who had died in Irish clothes at Kells, through the 5th Earl who had refused a throne, through Anne who had carried the bloodline forward in her brief and silent life. It had taken 131 years. From the execution of Roger Mortimer, 1st Earl of March, at Tyburn in 1330, to the coronation of Edward IV in 1461, for the Mortimer family to achieve what their most ambitious ancestor had grasped for and lost. The traitorous lords who had murdered a king and nearly stolen the English crown had, in the end, produced a king of their own. And the Mortimer blood did not stop with Edward IV. Through him it passed to every subsequent English monarch. When the Yorkist line was replaced by the Tudors in 1485, when Richard III, Edward IV's brother, fell at Bosworth Field, the crown passed to Henry VII, who married Edward IV's daughter, Elizabeth of York. Through Elizabeth, the Mortimer line continued into the Tudor dynasty, and from there into the Stuarts, the Hanoverians, and the Windsors. Every king and queen of England since 1461 has carried the blood of the Mortimers of Wigmore in their veins. The family that began with a Norman knight in a small village called Deadwater, a family that rose through centuries of warfare, marriage, treachery, and sacrifice, became, in the end, part of the fabric of the English monarchy itself. They are woven into the blood of the crown as surely as the Plantagenets, the Tudors, or the Stuarts. Every coronation that has taken place since Edward III's enthronement has been, in some quiet sense, a vindication of the Mortimer claim. Wigmore Castle, the great fortress where the dynasty had been born, stands in ruins today. A crumbling shell on a Herefordshire hillside, its walls broken, its towers fallen, its halls open to the sky and the wind and the rain. The castle that Ralph de Mortimer seized from a Saxon rebel in the year 1075, the castle where Roger Mortimer, the first Baron, planned his Welsh campaigns, the castle where the first Earl held his Arthurian tournaments and dreamed of kingship. All of it is gone, reduced to fragments of stone and memory. English heritage maintains the site, and visitors can walk among the ruins, tracing the outlines of walls and towers, that once rang with the voices of one of the most powerful families in medieval England. Wigmore Abbey, where generations of Mortimers were buried in the quiet darkness beneath the abbey floor, was dissolved during the Reformation in the 16th century, and little of it remains today. The tombs of the Mortimer dead, the first Baron who killed Simon de Montfort, the first Earl who overthrew a king, the second Earl who fought at Crecy, the third Earl who married a princess, the fourth Earl who died at Kells, have largely been lost, scattered or destroyed by the passage of centuries. The bones of the Mortimers, like the bones of so many medieval English families, lie unmarked and forgotten beneath the green Herefordshire earth. But the legacy endures. In the quiet churches of the Welsh marches, in the rolls of the English peerage, in the bloodlines of the royal house, in the pages of Shakespeare and the chronicles of Froissart and Le Baker. The Mortimers live on, a family that was forged in conquest, tempered by war, broken by ambition, and redeemed in the end by the patient, unrelenting power of blood. And so, as the last embers of this long story settle into ash, we come to the end of our journey through the House of Mortimer. From the wild shores of Normandy to the throne of England, across 4 centuries of war, ambition, love, betrayal, and the slow, stubborn persistence of a family that would not be denied. Let the names grow soft now. Let the castles fade. Let the battles and the plots and the crowns and the scaffolds slip gently away, like stones sinking slowly into still water. The story is told, the fire is low, and the night is yours. Sleep well. And if you have a moment before you drift off, a quiet like and a gentle comment about which Mortimer story surprised you most, help these stories find others who might need them. Good night.